Hi, I'm Yellow Sleeves, and I'm a product designer moonlighting as an indie artist and producer. Lychee and Black Tea. Artwork for music releases combines three of my biggest passions, which is the passion for music, the passion for artwork, and the passion for design. This video is primarily aimed at indie artists who have a DIY approach and want to make some artwork for their own music releases, but it's also relevant for designers or artists who aren't very familiar with this type of territory and could use a few pointers. This video is also going to assume that the output, the artwork itself, is going to be digital, and also the release is going to be digital only, so we're not going to talk too much about printing related topics. Given my background in various types of design and illustration, I want to share a few different tips with you, and hopefully they're going to help you with designing the artwork for your new EP or single or album release. All music releases need to be accompanied by some type of artwork. Obviously, the purpose of the artwork is going to be different for the digital world and for the physical world. For all physical releases, the artwork plays many different roles. It plays a part in advertising. In a traditional record store, a potential listener is going to be browsing through a lot of different vinyls or a lot of different CDs, and you would want the artwork to entice them to pick it up and get them interested and hopefully end up in a sale. And secondly, it plays the role of packaging. In the digital world, though, what this artwork does is it helps listeners navigate playlists a whole lot easier, and they can more easily identify whichever songs they want to listen to. So it acts as a sort of visual hook or a visual reference point when navigating any type of playlist. The good news is, though, that in between acting as a visual reference point to navigate a playlist and acting as advertising and packaging, the former is a lot lower of a bar, it's a lot more doable, a lot more achievable, and it doesn't take necessarily as much training as a designer or as an artist to put together. So it's a lot more viable for anyone at any skill level to come in and put together some artwork for a music release. Despite all of that, there are a few key things that you should keep in mind whenever you're designing this type of artwork. Number one, you need to think about the aspect ratio and the resolution. Number two, you need to think about what your visual hook is. And number three, you need to think about your composition. So let's talk about aspect ratios. Ever since CDs killed off cassettes, the main aspect ratio for vinyl cassettes and streaming platforms has been 1:1, which is a square. This means that you can use the same artwork in the same square shape on pretty much anything that has to do with your music release. Where this gets a bit sticky though is content creation, because we consume content in either 9:16, which is a portrait phone, or in landscape, which is 16:9. So you would need to think how this square picture is going to fit into content creation. Next up, let's talk about resolution. Now, resolution is really important. Generally, the bigger the better, to a point. The reason why I'm saying the bigger the better is because at some point you might want to print this out on either merch or flyers or whatever else. And if you have a good enough resolution, then the artwork itself is going to be able to stand on its own. Also, something to keep in mind is that different digital streaming platforms and different social medias have different resolutions that they prefer. And if you have a good enough resolution, a good enough size, let's say 5,000 by 5,000 pixels, you should be able to have all grounds covered and not have to worry about scaling your picture up and losing some of the quality of the image. The thing about printing out the artwork later on is that it's a decision that you should be making as early on in the process as you can. For best printing results, you'll need to set up your file so that it's ready for print. While I'm not going to go into any more detail about printing in general and setting up your files for it, if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments and I'm happy to get back to you. So let's talk about number 2 and number 3, which is the visual hook and the composition. These play off each other and they go hand in hand. As far as the visual hook is concerned, you need to remember that your listeners are going to be using this artwork to navigate playlists. So the quicker and easier it is for them to find your song, the better. Having a reasonably consistent style across multiple releases can be a pretty good idea. However, something you need to keep in mind is that if your artwork is too similar across releases, that's just going to make it harder for the listeners to find the specific song off of the specific release, and everything is going to become a bit of a mishmash. So, as long as your releases are distinct enough, you should be golden. So, what makes identifiable artwork? Well, that kind of depends. And I think this is where your creativity and your style and your identity as an artist or designer or indie artist can come in. This is where you can put your print on it. It can be either the shapes you use, it can be the colors you use, it can be the fonts you use. Although I'd be a little bit cautious with the fonts, and we'll get to that in a bit. It could be anything that makes your art look distinct enough, as unhelpful as that sounds. Also, you don't need to strive for memorable, although it is helpful, but going for recognizable is enough. Okay, but what's the difference between memorable and recognizable? Well, you could think about it as taking a test in school and you didn't really study for it. So when you read a question, you don't really remember the answer. But if someone tells you the answer, you can recognize whether it's true or not. Obviously, if you paid some attention. Another example that I can think of is if I asked you what order the colors of the Google logo show up in, you might not be able to tell me. However, if I show you some shapes in the colors in the exact same order as the colors in the Google logo, you are likely going to identify that as the Google colors in that order, and they are going to remind you of the Google logo. And you'll see that the shape doesn't really matter all that much because the colors themselves and the order they show up in are distinctive enough and recognizable enough to do the heavy lifting. So the actual letters and the order of the letters doesn't really matter. Okay, let's talk about composition. And the thing about composition is that the sooner you think about it and the sooner you nail it down, the better and the easier it is going to be for yourself. You want to think about the composition first and a concept for your artwork later, because it's a lot easier to fit a concept into a composition than it is to retrofit a composition into an already finished piece. While there's a lot of complexity that goes into what makes good composition, what you should primarily focus on is the fact that your listeners are going to see your artwork at a very small scale, either on their phones or on a web browser, and they're not going to see it as big as you're seeing it as you're creating the artwork. While on the topic of size, you need to remember that when seen at a small scale, a lot of the details that you're putting in aren't going to be noticeable. So your efforts are better spent on the bigger picture, the big shapes, rather than the minutia. The caveat for that, though, is if you are indeed planning on printing this for merch or for physical releases. Whenever the artwork is going to get printed on a larger size, it should be able to hold its own, whether it's on a t-shirt or whether it's on a poster or a vinyl cover. And if there isn't enough detail to make it interesting, it might be what you're going for. Minimalism is all good. But if you're going for something that's a little bit more illustrative, then you might want to make sure that regardless of whether it's a really small size or an A2 poster, well, however big a square fits into an A2 poster is, you need to make sure that this artwork reads well. The bigger shapes, the negative space, and the visual hook that we talked about earlier, all of these are going to play a massive factor in making your piece of art identifiable in a playlist flooded with hundreds and hundreds of songs. And who knows, maybe the artwork is interesting enough for someone to click on your song even if they're not familiar with your material. Personally, I like using diagonal compositions because that's going to leave me a little bit of space on one of the top corners and one of the bottom corners for placing the title of the release and the artist's name. I like to put it in because I like printing off my art on different types of merch, from t-shirts to stickers to magnets to mugs to whatever else, but you don't have to. And this is a pretty good segue into fonts and text on this type of artwork in general. Now, I don't think it's all that important to have the artist name or the song title or the album title on the artwork itself. Obviously, this was really important when the artwork was going on a physical print in a record store, but these days with the dimensions that most listeners are going to see the artwork at, if you can't fit the text in, you could actually consider not having it in at all. If you think about it, on streaming platforms, there's always going to be the name of the artist and the song title next to the artwork. So I think if you can't fit it into your composition, don't stress about it and you can just give up on it and it's absolutely fine. However, if you do insist on having artist or release names into the artwork, make sure you plan your composition around it. And remember, the text is likely not going to be legible anyway on streaming platforms, so it's a trade-off. Before I let you go, let's have a look at a few different album covers and see just how everything that we discussed works in practice. I'm going to use Queens of the Stone Age as an example because I'll take any excuse to talk about Queens of the Stone Age. And we'll be using this playlist I put together of their set list from the Glasgow 2023 gig because it has most of their catalog. So if we scan the albums top to bottom, we'll see that there's a few with very bold, bright colors. They tend to prefer colors in the pinkish, reddish, vermilionish type of area. But something else we can see is that there is a pretty strong visual language. If we have a look at Songs for the Deaf, which is also my favorite Queens of the Stone Age album, there's this bold background with the fork and it reads really well even at this size. If we look at Rated R, this again has a really strong, really bold white bar at the top with the deluxe edition bar at the bottom. Obviously the non-deluxe version is blue, but same sort of principles apply. Like Clockwork and Times New Roman and Villains were all made by Boneface, who is one of my favorite artists. However, two of them work at this size better than the third. If we have a look at Like Clockwork, you can see that the negative space around the characters reads quite well and the contrast is quite nice and bold, so even at this size you can identify the album cover. Villains does pretty much the same thing. We have the white negative space with the black and white character, and the Red Devil also reads really well. If we look at In Times New Roman though, things tend to get a little bit more lost. Now remember, these album covers were all made for physical releases, so I don't think navigating a playlist was very high on anyone's priority list. But still, compared to some of their other covers, it doesn't really read as well at this size. You can sort of tell that there's something happening over there, but it's really not the same as everything else. Moving forward or backwards in time, Era Vulgaris reads really well, has this pinkish color scheme background with the bold black top over there. The characters read quite well, the contrast is nice and high. And last on this list we have Lullabies to Paralyze, and alongside In Times New Roman, I don't think this does all that great of a job. You can tell that there's something happening down there and there's something happening around there, but overall in this playlist and in many other playlists, I don't think either of these two read as well as literally all of the rest of them. So in conclusion, you'll need to plan your artwork so that it fits into a square, or you'll need to be prepared to chop it up so that it does fit into a square. You need to think about where it's going to be used, whether it's just digital streaming platforms or you'll want to print it on merch later on. And if you do want to print it, you'll need to make sure that you set up your files and your resolution so that the print that you're going to get is good. Just a reminder, for most applications, I think 5000 by 5000 pixels should be fine. Although remember, the bigger the better in this case. And you need to make sure it's identifiable in playlists, potentially really big ones. That's it for today. If you have any questions about anything I covered in the video, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. If you found this video useful at all, I would really appreciate you subscribing. And until next time, have a good one.